I think Indonesia is pretty finicky about what it allows to pass through that strait in that sense, wartime versus.
Yes, absolutely. So there have been many discussions in Chinese strategic circles for those who follow them on the importance of China extending its geopolitical muscles, so to speak, into the Indian Ocean. Because let's not forget that for China itself to be recognized as a global superpower, you if you live right next to the Indian Ocean and you're unable to project power into the Indian Ocean, that is a serious challenge to the credibility of your own claim.
You're watching The Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Today we're going to be discussing choke points, and joining me from Colombo is Nilathan Niruthan, Director, Center for the Law and Security Studies in Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Nilathan. It's always a delight to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's always a delight to be on my favorite channel.
That's, person who just made my day. I mean, so, we're going to be talking about choke points, but I think, first of all, let's start off with what exactly is a choke point in modern geopolitics?
Right. So a choke point is essentially a small area which controls access to a much larger area. So the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Mexico, the Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait, which we will discuss more in depth today. All of these, if we could just look at them on a map, these are very small areas that control access to a much larger area. And we go through choke points in daily life all the time. I mean, even if you were to drive out into the streets of any metropolitan city, there would be choke points. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
the geopolitical importance of a choke point is determined by how important that overall area is. So the area that the choke point is providing access for, how important it is. So when we look at the world today, I would say there are about 4 or 5 key choke points. So the Malacca Strait, the Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el Mandeb, Panama Canal. These would all be examples of choke points. And as you know, when we look at global trade, particularly global energy trade, the merchant shipping industry, energy pipelines, undersea cables, and things like that, the world is very, even though it's almost a cliche to say that the world is interconnected, the world is now interconnected in not just the physical space, but also in the energy space, the digital space, and so on. And some of these geographic areas become very vital to maintain the stability of that. And that's what a choke point is.
Mm-hmm. So today, I think we'd rather discuss the Malacca Strait. I mean, I think ideally, as we were discussing earlier, I'd love to do a series on each one of these. But today, let's talk about the Malacca Strait. Why is the Malacca Strait considered a vital choke?
Okay, so the Malacca Strait, if we could just look at it on a map, is the point that connects the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. And essentially, any connectivity between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, what I suppose the Americans and their allies would call the Indo-Pacific region, the Malacca Strait is where that starts. The Malacca Strait is that vital choke point through which anything in the Indian Ocean can access anything in the Pacific Ocean by the shortest possible route, which is via the South China Sea. So there are two
Mhm.
reasons why I would make an argument that the Malacca Strait today is far more important than it was even, let's say, 6 months ago when it was already an important choke point. The first is because, as you know, there's currently a lot of debate over the long term future of India US relations, the long term future of India China relations, in terms of whether there's going to be some kind of either gradual or fast recalibration of relations and all that. So typically, geopolitical analysts like myself we use jargon like the Malacca dilemma. And the Malacca dilemma was essentially what many people characterize as a Chinese dilemma, which is, look, the Indians have a lot of access to the Malacca Strait because of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And if there was a hot conflict between the Americans and the Chinese, the overall consensus across the board in the United States, in India, and in China, the unanimous consensus has always been that India would prefer to side with the United States in such a conflagration because of civilizational identities, regional identities, territorial problems, and so on. But now that we are looking at a sort of recalibration of some of those things, I think the Malacca
Mhm.
Strait has again become really, really important. In some ways, it is India's actual trump card to be a Vishwaguru of sorts, because there's a lot of empty stuff that's thrown out a lot that talks about India's sort of key leverages, strategic leverages. The Malacca Strait is a real one. The Malacca Strait is India's most tangible strategic leverage in geopolitics. To sort of use a pun, it's India's most tangible trump card in geopolitics. So, and the other reason the Malacca Strait is more important now is because of the rise of AI. Now, why do I say the rise of AI? Well, it's because China is arguably the biggest driver in terms of setting up data centers and ramping up AI production. And AI requires a heavy amount of fossil fuel based energy. See, the energy transition that a lot of people speak about is really a myth because wind and solar are far, far away from being viable for any industry that requires a lot of energy. So, if we look at the AI industry, which requires a lot of energy, there's not a single major AI company in the world that is looking at wind and solar as options because wind and solar simply do not give them the kind of energy that's required to run a massive AI industry. And this therefore makes China's oil imports even more important. And something like 60% or 70% of China's oil imports come through the Malacca Strait. So if China wants to be an AI power, China really has to secure that access through the Malacca Strait. So both of these put together, I would say, make this area even more geostrategically important now than even 1 year or 2 years ago.
Mhm. But I mean, are we only talking about India and China at the moment? Because I'm sure that that strait is a passageway for a lot of maritime traffic.
Absolutely. So, as you know, the Malacca Strait has always been extremely important. So, the two reasons that I provided just now are the two new reasons for why it's even more important. But I mean, look, a quarter of the world's global trade, maritime trade, goes through the Malacca Strait. So, that's all we need to know in order to see that this is a macro picture that we are talking about. So, about a quarter of the entire trade of the maritime trade of the world goes through this. And what's ironic is that some parts of the Malacca Strait are less than 3 kilometers wide. Can you believe it? 25% of global trade is often dependent on a small passage of water that's less than 3 kilometers wide. So, yes, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't look at this simply as an India China dichotomous analysis. However, those are the two new reasons. The Malacca
Mhm.
Strait has been important to all the other countries for a long list of pre existing reasons.
Mhm. So, who sort of exerts the most influence over that region? I mean, who controls the straits?
So we would look at Singapore and Indonesia and nations like that as the residents, so to speak, of that zone. We would then look at the United States, which, I mean, China might have the largest navy in the world, but the United States has the largest meaningful navy in the world. As in, they've not just built a bunch of small craft in numbers and then just call themselves the world's largest navy. The United States genuinely has the largest real navy in the world in terms of warship class vessels. So they have a big presence there. China obviously is almost a localized power as well, because China's center of gravity is the South China Sea, which is between the
Mm-hmm.
Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But right now, geostrategically, the best nation that's poised to really exert control over the Malacca Strait if things go haywire, as I pointed out earlier, is India. Not particularly because of the Indian Navy's blue water capabilities, although India is working on that. It's more specifically because of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Once again, if we were to think in terms of a map, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands almost look right into the mouth of the Malacca Strait. If the Malacca Strait was a crocodile's mouth, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are staring directly into the crocodile's mouth. So India's control of that gives it a great deal of leverage there.
Mm-hmm. And India has also been sort of, ramping up its naval ties with Indonesia. There's actually talk that if needed, Indian warships could blockade the strait. But that would
Absolutely.
impact not just China, but again, shipping throughout the world.
Absolutely. So, one thing that India could use, as you pointed out, would be a blockade, or let's say even some kind of exclusion zone, right? So, if we remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during the Falklands War, uh, key choke points related to those conflicts were all blockaded. So, there is a practice in terms of geopolitics. Blockades are a real thing, exclusion zones are a real thing. The other major leverage that India could have there is, let's say there are non-state actors which now become very rampant in that area. You have
Mm-hmm.
India that is most well placed as an external power to come in and aid nations like Indonesia and Singapore and all that, because of this geographic access it has. I mean, if we went back 1,000 years in time, the Cholas essentially conquered Southeast Asia by using the piracy argument that they needed to come in there and have a presence in order to crush piracy that was rampant in the Malacca Strait. So those are two things. And of course, a third one would be, so even though this might never happen, we should never underestimate the idea of mining. I'm not saying India is going to do it, but in a hot conflict, you cannot discount nations using that as a tactic, and that tactic will have devastating consequences for the rest of the world, right? So, for example, if Iran wanted to mine the Strait of Hormuz, or their part of the Strait of Hormuz, that would have devastating impacts on the world economy. We know that the Taiwanese have already mined large parts of the Taiwan Strait in order to prevent any kind of maritime invasion from the Chinese Navy. So straits get mined, and there are fears that straits will get mined all the time. And even for some tactic like that, I would argue that India is best placed to pull that off.
Mm-hmm. But when we are talking about South China Sea, I mean that's essentially that the Indo-Pacific, if you want to look at it that way. The fight there right now is mostly between the West and China, and of course the countries there. So is the strait as important in that conflict?
I would say it becomes even more important in that conflict, because just as how the Malacca Strait is key for China's energy security, that same strait is also key for the energy security of all US allies. So just as how, so for instance, the reason why the United States has always been so active in the Middle East is not particularly for their own interests. It's for their allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, Israel, so on. So, similarly, even here, the reason the Americans are so invested in this is not particularly because the Malacca Strait is important for them in such a direct way, but that the Malacca Strait is key for the Singapores and the Japans and the South Koreas and the Philippines of this world, where the Malacca Strait is once again what connects them to the rest of the world. right? There is the
Yeah.
Sunda Strait, which is an alternative to the Malacca Strait and all that, but you got to go like an additional 500 miles or something like that for the Sunda
Hmm.
Strait. So for China and for US allies in that region, the Malacca Strait becomes even more important in the event of a conflict.
Hmm. But in the event of, let's say, a hot conflict in that particular region, as we are talking, you know, anything that comes through the straits into the Bay of Bengal from that strait comes immediately within the purview of the Indian Navy. I mean, the Indian Navy has been boasting that we can see anything that comes in from there, including submarines. But I think we were discussing before we started this conversation about the Chinese wanting an aircraft carrier to come. Now, first of all, can an aircraft carrier come through the straits if it really wanted to, given that I think Indonesia is pretty finicky about what it allows to pass through that strait in that sense, wartime versus.
Yes, absolutely. So there have been many discussions in Chinese strategic circles for those who follow them on the importance of China extending its geopolitical muscles, so to speak, into the Indian Ocean. Because let's not forget that for China itself to be recognized as a global superpower, you if you live right next to the Indian Ocean and you're unable to project power into the Indian Ocean, that is a serious challenge to the credibility of your own claim as a global power. And China realizes that. And I myself have attended conferences in China less than a year ago, in fact, where I heard Chinese admirals saying in those conferences that by 2035 at least, China should have at least one aircraft carrier visiting the Indian Ocean, not with hostile intentions, but with the intention of power projection. So, because they know that it's very important for China's global image as a maritime power to be able to project their muscle, so to speak, into those regions as well. Now, whether this is feasible or not would once again come down to the circumstances on the ground. So, for instance, if Indonesia is finicky about it, is Indonesia ready to actually do what it takes when push comes to shove? If a Chinese aircraft carrier does make that move, or will it be a case where the Chinese call Indonesia's bluff and Indonesia essentially realizes that they have to sit back and watch this happen, right? So it all depends on leverage. And we've also got to remember that China sees itself in a much, much stronger position 10, 15 years from now because of the thing that we discussed in our last conversation, which is critical minerals. China has
Absolutely.
the entire world in a vice grip, so to speak, because of this critical minerals industry. And they only see their leverage increasing over the next decade and a half rather than decreasing. So I don't think they're too worried about Indonesia, for instance, blocking access. I think they're very confident that they can, at any rate, at least arm twist the Indonesians into backing off.
Hmm. So in that case, the port that they have built in Myanmar, is that a particularly important point to visit for a Chinese vessel? I mean, I'm just
Yeah,
thinking out loud.
I think it certainly would be. I mean, as we all know, the BRI itself, the Belt and Road Initiative itself, many people say was Xi Jinping's response to the Malacca dilemma. The whole seed of the Belt and Road Initiative itself comes from Beijing's realization that there is a major existential problem here. That if a hot war escalates and they cannot exert control over the Malacca Strait, their energy supplies and food supplies would get strangled out entirely. But the China Pakistan economic corridor, there's been very little progress there. The China Myanmar economic corridor, there's been very little progress there. Some limited progress because of China's own power in that region. But I mean, yes, this kind of pathway that they are building through Myanmar will be important. But the importance of that will be decided by the success of the larger BRI project. And right now, the
Hmm.
larger BRI project is not looking too good, to be honest.
Hmm. But since we are talking about other sort of alternates, I'm just again thinking out loud. There is also talk that once the Arctic route opens up, the importance of the Malacca Strait sort of diminishes. Would you agree with that?
So I would agree to a small extent, right? But I also think we need to keep in mind something. So I don't know if you've heard of this thing called Jevons paradox. So Jevons paradox is a basic concept where when one form of energy becomes more efficient, we assume that we're going to start using less of it. But what actually happens in reality is that we start using more of it. So even though this Arctic thing will, in theory, make it more viable for countries to travel both ways if they choose to, what I think will end up happening is traffic in the Malacca Strait and in the Arctic will increase. So it's kind of
Hmm.
like how when oil became very cheap, right? And people thought we would start using less oil. But what's actually happened is we use way more oil and fossil fuels now than we ever have before. And as fossil fuels become cheaper and more efficient, we only use it more, not less. So, similarly,
Hmm.
as the Arctic routes and all that become clearer, we will see an increase in the overall global maritime trade output rather than one replacing the other. I think Gion's paradox will play a big role there where both these areas start seeing an explosion because many new industries, many new economies, many new ecosystems, financial ecosystems will start being created out of global trade once the Arctic regions become more accessible. And this will only create an explosion rather than a reduction of trade in these other areas.
Also, I mean, it just struck me that geographically, West Asia is the primary source of oil right now, in that sense. So, geographically, that is much closer via the Malacca Straits than going all the way around the Arctic to reach China, right?
Absolutely. And remember, for all of this Arctic stuff is only under the assumption that the current relationship between the Russians and the Chinese continues in the same trajectory.
Hmm.
China's entire Arctic strategy depends on whether they have good relations with Russia or not. And as you know, I tend to be a very civilizational thinker. As far as I'm concerned, the Russians and the Chinese are civilizational rivals. They might go through short periods of 50 or 60 years at most where they are allies. But in the long run, those two are always destined to compete with each other. And I don't really see that being as reliable as the Malacca Strait for China. Even if that place opens up, it's dependent on this volatile civilizational partnership holding on, which I don't see it holding on in for the next 100 years, maybe for the next 30 or 40. But the Arctic will become a major trade source only by that time. So,
Right.
yeah.
You know. So, before we sort of conclude, we're just running out of time. Could we just come back again to India's role that
Hmm.
region? Now, Indonesia, I think, has allowed some kind of naval presence, Indian naval presence in this thing, but it has been always very iffy about allowing naval presence in that region because I guess also because the Chinese might object and everybody might object. What are India's options? Can it stay out of Indonesian waters and still blockade the Malacca Strait if it wanted to?
Yeah, India certainly could. So, in terms of that localized area itself, you would need Indonesia and Singapore. But in
Hmm.
terms of blocking access from other parts of the world, we've still got to remember that there are only two or three small gaps in the Malacca Strait that ships can go through. And the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are key access points to all of those gaps. So, for any external power to now come through the Cape of Good Hope or sail all the way from the Gulf of Mexico or from the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el Mandeb, any of that, you will eventually need to pass through India's zone of maritime influence in one way or the other, right? And if I could just point out, there is a strategic question that India now needs to answer as well, right? Which is this whole idea of an Indo-Pacific. So
Right.
the Indo-Pacific, as you know, is a term you could say used and coined by the Western Alliance.
Yeah,
China
absolutely.
disagrees with this concept fundamentally. China says there's the Indian Ocean and there's the Pacific Ocean. There's no such thing as the Indo-Pacific. It's all an American conspiracy, blah blah blah. So now
Hmm.
India needs to decide what India's macro position on this is. Does India say we are a Indian Ocean power and it stops at Malacca, where we are essentially the gatekeepers of the Malacca Strait? Or does India consider itself an Indo-Pacific power under the construct of, let's say, something like the Quad, where it's both the Indian region and the Pacific region coming together? So
Hmm.
India kind of needs to really answer and emphasize on that question. Are you guys going to be the gatekeepers of the Malacca Strait, or are you going to be part of a larger alliance which views the Indian Ocean as a part of a larger Indo-Pacific sphere of influence?
I mean, even if you were to look at the previous thing as a possibility of it being a gatekeeper, that would still impact anything that happens. I mean, using the Malacca Strait, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. The question is that exercise of power over the Malacca Strait for India's individual sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean, or is that power over the Malacca Strait going to be exercised as part of a larger international coalition in an Indo-Pak region? So it comes
Okay.
down to that. Are you going to exercise that for your own local individualized power projection, or part of a
Hmm.
much larger canvas?
Hmm. So, I mean, do you see any immediate conflict in that area right now? I mean, immediately, do you see anything happening?
I mean, with Taiwan, you never really know, right? Because the signs all point to there being no escalation for the moment. I mean, I saw a
Hmm.
Trump interview recently where he was like, "Oh yeah, President Xi told me that he would never invade Taiwan as long as I was in power." So does
Hmm.
that mean that they are ready to invade Taiwan once Trump goes? Does that
That's,
mean
yeah.
that, I mean, we have no idea. So it all depends on the volatility of Taiwan, because as
Hmm.
you know, with these conflicts, we can go through an entire logical sequence of possibilities and come to the conclusion that a hot conflict is not possible. And then somebody makes an emotional decision somewhere.
A
Somebody
black
takes an
swan moment.
illogical
Yeah.
step. Exactly. And everything just goes to hell. I mean, ultimately, the thing that we need to remember is that sea power is not meant to be exercised simply for the sake of sea power. Sea power is meant to be exercised to influence events on the land. That's the whole point of sea power.
Right.
And therefore, whatever sea power or leverage that any of these countries might have over the Malacca Strait, ultimately the intention is to influence events on the land rather than the sea itself.
Hmm. This is a fascinating discussion we've just had, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions we have on the other choke points eventually, because if this is what the Malacca Straits is all about, I can imagine what the other choke points like the Suez and the Panama, I mean, they all
there's a
would have their own.
there's a whole Pandora's box out there, trust me.
I think we should talk about that because it's a fascinating topic which not too many people have really explored in that sense.
Yes.
You know? But I think you've opened at least my eyes, and I'm sure a lot of people who are going to be watching this with this particular aspect. But sadly, we have to, close this particular interview because we've run out of time. Thank you so very much again. And as I said before, absolute delight to have you with us, and I look forward to having you with us again.
Thank you. I would be on every day if I had the chance, so it was my pleasure.
Thank you.